I still think people get the right to choose what they believe, but I think if your beliefs are crap, then people should address them. I think they have to be confronted.
Hi, Culminators. Thank you for joining me today. I want you to meet a new friend. This is Ray McCoy. He is a researcher and writer, and his present interest is on the 9/11 hoax. Not the 9/11 hoax that it was done by somebody other than Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, but the hoax that it was not done by Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. In other words, the proliferation, especially in the last few years, of widespread belief that Israel or the Jews or both are responsible for 9/11. This is going to be competing with a million other videos on this topic. But Ray McCoy this is his debut, and he has put his heart and soul into this. I know it, and I want to hear from him, and I'm looking forward to stimulating some interesting discussion. Ray, how you doing?
Thank God. It's good to speak to you. I definitely admire your First Amendment work.
Why, thank you.
And that's basically why I reached out to somebody who has that perspective, because I want to make it clear I've never supported censoring any of the opinions or beliefs that we're going to discuss today, even though I really think they are just very dishonest and in some cases defamatory towards individuals and towards entire classes of people. But if you want a little background on me, it's not quite my debut. I have talked about this a couple other times, but this probably would be the closest to a mainstream audience that I've talked about this to. It's been more
That's you,
like
Culminators.
Right. So I have talked to, I don't think you know him, even though he is also on the East Coast, but Halsey English, I've talked to him about it. I've done a debate on this through his channel. And I've also spoken to a group of Israeli creators about it. And basically why I am devoting so much time to this. When I first broached this topic in 2019, it was coming up during what was called the Groyper War. And I had only really heard about it as, in specifics. There had always been, of course, rumblings about it, probably in July 2019. And then I debated Ryan Dawson about it, who is the most well-known person to really proliferate the theory and tell people that that's the true story of 9/11, the dancing Israelis being part of some orchestrated plot to have this happen, and having all of the different jihadist groups and the operatives basically as, what's the word, marionette dolls that are basically unconsciously being followed all the time. So, and then I kind of walked away from it because, of course, in the Groyper War wasn't really that big of a deal in 2019 unless you were really into internet drama. And
now, how did you get into it in the first place, though?
I happened across an article in Mint Press News. And if you're not familiar with them, they seem to have at least a pro-Iran bent in terms of their editorial policy. But they have a reporter named Whitney Webb, who is an investigative reporter. And she was examining some photos that had been they'd been declassified by the FBI relating to the Dancing Israelis FBI file. So the file had been public, I believe, since 2012. Okay. But some of the photos that they'd taken were not declassified until 2019. So I read the article and I started to realize that this was a very flimsy theory because if you think about it, people, even if they're behaving inappropriately and suspiciously, and that you're right to call the police on them, it doesn't mean that they are guilty of a crime that happened concurrently to that behavior, right? So,
Well,
um,
that's one of many reasons why it's ridiculous, right? I mean,
yeah,
if you're part of a group of saboteurs and not only saboteurs but chaos agents who are capable of this immense false flag operation of this literally historic proportions, you're going to drop your cover and celebrate by dancing in public as soon as your mission is accomplished.
during the mission, also before, when they were cited by the witness, I believe it was right after the second tower had been hit by United Airlines flight. I think it was flight 175 that hit the South Tower. So, in order for the theory to have any credibility of foreknowledge, I'm not talking about orchestration, but just foreknowledge, it would at least have to be proven that they were able to get footage or some sort, just still photographs of Flight 11, American Airlines Flight 11 that Mohammed Atta was piloting, crashing into the North Tower. And that doesn't exist. The witness also claimed that they were holding a camcorder with an LCD screen. Well, that camcorder has never been found. They had a Canon film camera that was recovered when they were arrested. So a lot of the theories hinge on this notion that they passed off this camcorder and it's never been found, and that holds the whole key to it. But so just I started, of course, with the dancing Israelis and just the preposterous notion that if you were doing this grand scheme, one of the elements would be to have three people stand on a ground level garage rooftop in Union City, New Jersey, and film it from that distance, which is ridiculous. And in fact, I believe later in the day, it says in the FBI file. So there is an FBI file. These people were arrested. They were investigated. Apparently, so employees of that company, including one that was identified that was later one of these arrested, did go to Liberty State Park, but that was much later in the day. Liberty State Park is across the Hudson from the World Trade Center and Battery Park. So that was a much better view. Why didn't they set up over there to begin with? Why was this all? Some of the photos that were disclosed happened to be from the rooftop of their place of business in Weehawken, which is at a lower elevation than Union City. So at some point, they're on this rooftop garage. They say, "Hey, this view isn't good. We're obstructed." You can even see a bridge in front of them. So they're obstructed. They remember that there is this place where their moving company had facilitated a move earlier that week, and they drive only a short distance away to the Doric Towers in Union City. That's where they were seen by that civilian witness, and she reported them to the police. They're later picked up in the afternoon in East Rutherford after they'd been driving around trying to get back to their apartment in Brooklyn, which they couldn't get to because the movement had basically been locked down.
It was impossible to get across the tunnel. The tunnels were all closed.
Right. So a lot of the theory hinges on them having this plan that was easily just made impossible. Like they said, oh, they all had plane tickets. Well, on their persons, there were, I believe, two people that had travel documents, which were more like itineraries. and some of them were for past flights. One of them, I believe, was for a flight the following March. And then, yes, there was a guy who was supposed to fly out of the country, I believe, on the 12th, because his time as a mover had finished. One of the other people arrested with him was his replacement with the company. So that's why he'd just been flown in.
In other words, they worked for a moving company.
Yes. So all five of the people arrested worked for Urban Moving Systems, which if you type into Google, you'll get tons and tons and tons and tons of results.
Because they're the ones who blew up the Twin Towers, right?
Correct. Yeah. Because with the moving van that, there's a moving van that's really crazily photoshopped. If you look it up, you can actually see the plane in the tower. But there are people out there that believe that that's the real van. Anyway, so the owner of the company appears to be, not appears to be, he was an Israeli national, and his wife also co-managed the company with him. They did flee to Israel not long after the 9/11 attacks and were basically, wanted for questioning by the FBI for several years later. Why do you think that they would be fleeing abroad? Well, most of their workforce was illegal aliens, and 5 of their people had just been picked up, and others were talking to the FBI about how sketchy the business was and the unscrupulous practices of it.
They were Israelis who were working in the U.S. on tourist visas?
The arrested movers, correct.
Got it.
So none of them, and none of the other workers either that were movers. So a lot of them, they might not be Israeli, but according to other witnesses that were in the FBI file, were nationals of other countries, Georgia, Russia, the Eastern Europeans. So, one of the things that fuels the belief in this is that because they were arrested on 9/11, because they were suspects, and because they behaved suspiciously, that they must have been involved in attacks. And the reality is that there were many foreign nationals and Americans who were rolled up after the attacks. Some of them were, they were criminals, but they were not related to the attacks themselves. And one of the things that helped to proliferate the story, ironically, is the Jewish Daily Forward. So to put this into perspective, people think that this was a huge cover-up, and yet some of the publications that were most involved in at least getting some of the bare details out about this were Jewish Daily Forward and Haaretz at different points. I think the Forward published an article about it the same month. And of course, it's a human interest story because after 9/11, they want to highlight the effect of the aftermath of the attack on American Jews, but also Israelis living in America. And so why not report on it? People don't think of a story developing into this full-blown narrative of, oh, these are the real people around the attacks. So as a result, this became a much bigger story than it had to be. And because it's been conflated with the second story, I think I also wrote to you about it, called the art student story, which is not really related to it, but is always confused with it. That happened in other states, mostly in Florida, Texas, and other parts of the southern U.S. I could go into that too if you want.
Yeah, please do, because you did send me that link, but I think people are not familiar with it. Okay,
so the art students was this other group of people that they were arrested earlier that year in the spring of 2001. And these were people who were peddling art door to door in especially Florida, but also the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I think there were people in Missouri that were arrested, and they happened to. So they were basically just door-to-door salesmen. And these geniuses who were Israelis on tourist visas, just like the movers, decided, let's peddle art at offices of federal agencies, the Federal Protection Service, and the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. And imagine how brilliant of a scheme it is. So the narrative is, these people were spying on the DEA, and this was also in part an operation to surveil 9/11 suspects, because there were 9/11 suspects that were in Hollywood, Florida, around the same, well, actually a little later than when these people were deported, which is a little important, right?
Wasn't the flying school in Florida?
Yes, the flying school was in Florida. So there was another group of two of the hijackers, Marwan al-Shahi and Mohammed Atta, were flying out of, I think it was in Venice, Florida. So that was close to where one group of these people was arrested. But what does close mean? It means about 2 counties away. So there is no evidence. Let me make this clear. All of the information that is about this art student theory comes from what's called the DEA report and the Shea memorandum, which cited the DEA report, which was submitted by an attorney named Gerald Shea. He was the former district attorney for San Luis Obispo County, California. And he took a special interest in this. And he said, yeah, this is suspicious. I'm going to take this to the 9/11 Commission. After they had already concluded their sessions and their report, he said, well, you left this out. And he listed all these places where there had been hijackers, and then where some of these people were also present in the, around the same period. But if you look at the timelines, they generally don't line up. And also there's no evidence that they actually surveilled any hijackers. All of the evidence relating to these people is that federal agents observed them peddling art in their vicinity or going to their offices, going to DEA offices. Imagine these people who are used to pulling off bogus transactions with real criminals, and somebody comes to their office and says, hi, in some really terrible English. And they say, I am artist. I have, they have this screen painted canvas, and they're trying to sell you the art that they say they're making and that they're creating in art school. And it was really, to think about how much nowadays they talk about how brilliant the Mossad is, and they have double agents and they have layers upon layers of deception. And people do still believe that they were this careless to have created a scheme where people just walk in the front door and act like they own the place and spy on a federal agency. And there's no explanation that I've heard as to why it would be the DEA in Texas, Florida, I think Phoenix, Arizona, Chattanooga.
But any conspiracist would say to you, that's exactly why they chose that DEA.
Right.
Because you'd never expect it. And the thing about conspiracies, right, is that they're unfalsifiable. You can always rationalize from observable facts or from, contradictions or internal contradictions. And they'll say, well, that's how it was designed. It was designed to throw you off that way.
Yes. Any attempt to dismiss this whole thing based on, common sense logic or statements within the FBI file, or just glancing at the timeline and saying, well, okay, so here's a key narrative that they've always introduced. They've said, based on a German newspaper article, that there were hijackers that were living right next door to some of these suspects. So Dawson, I actually brought this up in our debate 6 years ago, still has not answered it. He says this all the time. And I said, okay, what's the address where you say that these hijackers lived right next door to these suspects? Because you keep mentioning the name of one of the 5 dancing Israelis. Jersey Five, but everybody knows them as the Dancing is Real. He always mentions Yaron Shmuel because he did live in, he had a Florida driver's license and a listed address, of course, and he didn't have it during the debate, and nobody has it because he didn't live in Hollywood, Florida. He lived, I believe, in Palm Beach. So I believe Palm Beach is in Palm Beach County, or sorry, no, he lived in Miami Beach, so that's in Miami-Dade County, and Hollywood is in Broward County. It's not neighbors at all. It's not next door. It's not anything. It's not the same zip code. There is no connection between him and Mohammed Atta or Marwan al-Shahi because he didn't live there at the same time that we know of. So that line is just him conflating deliberately those two stories in order to say, well, how could he also have been caught after observing the attacks and celebrating, and then also have lived next door to these hijackers? Well, the answer is that one thing he did and the other thing he didn't. And if he was surveilling the hijackers, why did they pull him off of the surveillance in order to film the attacks themselves from across the river? None of those questions are ever asked because the people him and others who propagate this, the audience that they speak to or the people that host them generally aren't looking to test the narrative. They're not looking to be curious about whether this is indeed a feasible plot. They look at it as a series of facts that build up into a real conspiracy, but they don't actually explain how the conspiracy works. And that's actually the subject of an article I wrote not long ago. I think I sent it to you, called "The Piper Doctrine is Alive and Well." So that's where I get into some of the older 9/11 truth stuff and some of the narratives that are being recycled, and how the psychology of the movement evolved from the early fantastic theories about holograms and energy weapons and stuff like that just people stopped really paying attention. And instead they have to get into some, John Wick crazy, or I guess what would be like a complicated plot line where this guy is conflicted and this guy has, this guy's married to somebody's sister-in-law. So that's what they started focusing on now, which is what Ryan Dawson calls 9/11 for grown-ups. Well, Michael Collins Piper, who is somebody that he openly admires and was a member of a white supremacist group called the Liberty Lobby, he's a person who started that mentality. He said, well, I'm not going to be able to explain to you how it worked, but I'm going to definitely show you who did it. And that's where this is what this is all about. It's about guilt by association. It's not anything to do with establishing guilt through evidence.
Well, I mean, I think the best example of that is that at this point, you referred a few minutes ago to the FBI has this in their file. The FBI confirmed this. The mentality now is, oh, well, the FBI is run by the Mossad. In other words, you can't even posit the FBI as a fair broker. And believe me, I'm well aware of the problems with the FBI. It's got to be the topic of a third of my episodes. But in terms of being tools of the Mossad, I mean, and that's, by the way, why I've always been very skeptical of the idea that Epstein was a joint Mossad FBI blackmail operation, because I don't think those two organizations work together on those kinds of projects. They are in fact, I think, rivals to a very large extent, and there might be some things that they cooperate on. But how do we get out of this self-referential box where there's no any standard, any fact, any measuring stick is just used as further proof of the conspiracy?
So, in my opinion, there's a couple ways. There's an active way and there's a passive way. I'll explain the passive way first. which is I don't think we can wait for that. But in my experience, and I go through it in an article I wrote called "The Danner Affair," related to Michael Collins Piper and Israelis and other related um, topics like the Epstein narrative, which I'm not saying the Epstein thing is false. I don't know the truth about it, but they hate each other. There's this big, there's this culture where there's no honor among thieves in the 9/11 truth movement, and a lot of the other new conspiracy movements that have come out since then, such as Sandy Hook or the Pizzagate stuff, or people are basically competing as to who can really be the truth teller, right? So and don't get me wrong, if people want to watch these shows, I don't care, right? But you always see them just stabbing each other in the back, or calling each other shills, or you see Alex Jones today being called basically an Israel firster or something. Well, people were saying that about him back in 2006. I was actually listening to I was listening today in a podcast I found from back in 2006 by a guy named Victor Thorne, who was saying, he won't speak about Israel. And so the truth is, I don't necessarily think that these are people who can really build themselves into a fighting force without striking each other down, because they don't have motives of looking for truth. They have motives that are self-serving generally. Okay. The active way is something that I'm trying to engage in, which is to point out that in many cases, these are people who contradict themselves, or that they believed in theories that they now they would concede that they're discredited now, but they're ashamed to say that they believed in. In Ryan Dawson's case, back then, around the same period. So this is somebody who is a little bit older than me. I'm not yet 40. Back when he was in his 20s, he was claiming that there's 100% proof that neither Mohammed Atta nor Ziad al-Jarrah, the pilot of United Flight 93, were actually on the planes. And he's conceded since then that that's not true. But people should face issues. They have issues with their credibility when they say that stuff. The problem is that it's been long enough in the past that people don't remember.
Well, to some extent, it's the David Irving problem until he made the mistake of filing that lawsuit. But he got away with rolling serial red-handed misrepresentations of the historical record and was recognized as an unreliable historian. He was already a fairly marginal person by the time which was why, I don't know if it's a chicken or egg, but he had gotten to be closer and closer to the line of Holocaust denial than he had been in the 1960s by the time he got to the 1980s, because no one else was listening to him, because he wasn't really a particularly good historian. He was not trained as an historian. He made many mistakes, and he was found to be a person who wasn't really all that useful. But as you point out, it's funny because we always say the internet never forgets, but it forgets.
Yeah, it's not a matter of the internet forgetting. It's that people, like, I run up against this problem a lot, which is that sites go offline. They you have to look at archived information. It's not always complete, and so to compile a lot of this information, sometimes you have to jump through a lot of hoops. And so in my opinion, people have to take this active approach. And I'm not just talking about my topic. Okay. I picked this topic because I'm a millennial. I'm not a New Yorker, but if I was a New Yorker, I'd feel very passionate about what is the truth about 9/11. And I understand why a lot of these people may have started out and wanted to get to the bottom of something that was very murky, thanks to government incompetence and the incompetence that led to the 9/11 attacks. Perhaps why would you not include the possibility of a conspiracy, whether it is by Israel or by the United States? So I don't fault people for questioning it, but I do believe that at a certain point, it becomes something where people are using the topic for their own personal edification, in some cases to profit from it, and also to tear down others. And I'm not only talking, I'm not using the anti-Semitism thing, because if it wasn't this issue, it would be something else. But these are people who are generally, they're crabs in a barrel. They're always trying to destroy rather than actually look for real knowledge. And um, so so the reason I'm putting together this book, like I said, this is a generational issue. A lot of people from the boomer generation, my dad's generation, he was born in Israel, but Americans remember the JFK assassination. That's why Kennedy theories are very strong among that age group. It's not to say that people of my age don't find them interesting, but less so. Um, but in terms of 9/11, the narrative is being lost way earlier, I feel, than with the Kennedy assassination. I'm not saying that the official narrative is correct, but a lot of these crank theories are gaining much more credence, thanks in part to the refusal by, organizations and, quote unquote, serious people to actually address them and go down into the details. It sounds like a waste of time. I understand why people think it's a waste of time. Believe me, it isn't. People's minds have been changed. Some of these big internet personalities like Myron Gaines, I feel, they had the 9/11 issue used as a fulcrum to swing them into the position that they're in. Maybe not 100% of it is because of 9/11, but I noticed a huge change in him. I've noticed huge changes in other creators. I've noticed people on the left become, they were not necessarily sympathetic to Israel beforehand. I'm not saying that they were like, friendlies before that, but they've now embraced actual old school medieval style hatreds, in part because they were gatewayed there by some of these theories, because it resonates with their age group. So that's why I personally find this to be worthwhile to do. I still think people get the right to choose what they believe, but I think if your beliefs are crap, then people should address them. I think they have to be confronted.
Part of, I think, the problem that we're facing also is modern social media. It really is adapted to quick takes, hot takes, simplistic takes. And you'll see all kinds of use of the term. Well, I mean, at this point, it's become a parody. Jet fuel doesn't melt steel beams. Uh, the last year or so, the World Trade Center 7 has been the obsession with people. And science can be hard, engineering can be hard. And I understand one of the things we learned during COVID was that's a two-way street. Scientists say, the government says, and we want the quick take, and we have trusted people. And part of this also feeds into the conspiracy minding, of course. We've trusted people who have turned out to not be entitled to trustworthiness. And as you point out, we've learned with respect to 9/11 about a much more extensive involvement of certain members of the Saudi family, which was covered up. It was covered up. It was omitted from the public version of the report. And how that shifted over to the Israelis. I mean, it wasn't 2025 where there's this de facto détente between Israel and Saudi Arabia. In 2001, Saudi Arabia and Israel were not cooperating powers by any stretch of the imagination. Um, but popular mechanics did so much to examine so many of the physical aspects and the engineering aspects, the scientific aspects of these claims, separate and apart from what you talked about at the beginning, the who, what, when, where stuff. And people just, when presented with facts like that, they do the same thing that they do when someone demonstrates that something that's claimed by Hamas to have been a fact, have been a school is actually a missile factory. Well, why would you believe that? We're at the same level of people who have come to believe that Eisenhower was in on the Holocaust hoax. I have to do air quotes so that someone doesn't clip this. Eisenhower and even Patton vomited in the death camp. As anti-Semitic as he was and contemptuous of Jews, he was disgusted. So I mean, there is just a level of cognitive dissonance. But what I think you're saying is that there has to be pushback. There has to, you're not in a university or an editor at Popular Mechanics or in some anti-Semitic, some anti-Semitism committee or a think tank. You're just another guy on the internet who is tired of hearing people passing off BS for the truth.
Well, okay. So I don't know if I mentioned this at the beginning, but I'm mentioning it now. I was a writer, a contributor. I wasn't a paid contributor, but I was a contributor to American Greatness, which is Trump-oriented.
I know American Greatness.
And
yeah.
I have no, my politics. I think I try to remain independent. I don't necessarily take the same side every time, but I've seen narratives that were on the Trump side that were wrong, and I've seen obviously on the other, the Democrat side. I don't really support their politics. I'm a very pro-life person, but I think you have to examine the validity of each side all the time. But two things on different things that you did mention about Saudi Arabia and about the influence of social media. If you read an article on my newsletter on Substack, it's the Jaffa Substack, Jewish Alliance for the First Amendment. I wrote about something that I call the Danner Affair, where in 2006, there was a guy who came forward to Michael Piper and he said, I was a witness to an aircraft that was not a Boeing colliding into the Pentagon, basically validating the loose change theory. And he wanted to come forward.
Explain the loose change theory.
So loose change, I've only seen it once, and I'm not really interested in so if people like the film, whatever, knock yourself out. I don't really agree with the premise of it, but fine. But loose change was a big blowout moment for the 9/11 truth movement because it was one of the first movies that went viral simply off of internet promotion, and it promoted this idea that it was not an aircraft, it was not a passenger aircraft that collided with the Pentagon specifically, but it was a guided missile or a drone. And the reason for this was because I believe at the time they didn't have actual video footage of it, and people were like, well, how come the Pentagon has no, it's the Pentagon, right? Of course the Pentagon would have video footage. Later it emerged that there is some very bad grainy footage of it flying through like a parking turnstile or something.
Yes, I've seen that. Yeah.
So what?
Two different angles.
Needless to say, that did not compel the loose change people to change their minds. But there's a whole universe of people that talk about loose change, and I'm not going to get into that because it would defeat a lot of my purpose. But this guy came forward, and at the time, Piper was kind of, an all of the above guy. So he was interested in that. He was interested in the Jews. He was interested in, connecting everything to the Jews. He was interested in like anything that he could do to promote this idea that, yes, there's something deeply wrong with what happened on 9/11. So this Sam Danner guy comes on his show, and he spins this yarn, And then people who actually read into what happened at the Pentagon started to come forward and say, look, um, you know, this guy's full of crap. And they presented all of these, actual evidence that the and the timeline and the placement of where he was, he could not have seen it happen. He'd mentioned the Shanksville plane United 93 crashing on his way to the Pentagon, which doesn't make any sense because that happened afterwards.
His geography and his highways were all wrong.
Everything was wrong. So this created within that small subculture at the time this big conflict because you had multiple, like I'm saying, these people cannot get on the same side because they don't actually like each other. So they tore each other apart. This is something that is a product of it's even more present today because of social media. It was more present at the time because the internet and chat and forums. And this is not something necessarily that would have been a big deal back in the 60s when people were talking about Kennedy, because people were much slower to really react to it because there were only 3 networks. People got their news from the newspaper, and yes, the conspiracy theories existed, but how did Danner fall apart? This guy who said that the Pentagon was hit by a global hawk drone. It's because his son came forward and said, yeah, my dad is making up stuff. And so unfortunately, there's not enough people who are willing to come forward today and say, I'm sorry, but we have this guy in our family, and it's just not true. What I'm saying is that back in the Kennedy among boomers or people who were older than that, the people you would talk to about these things were generally people you knew and saw and were personally acquainted with. Nowadays, you can get into these big rabbit holes with people you will never meet in real life. And I think it's, in some sense it's exciting, but it does lead to a lot of these very crazy subcultures that are getting more and more extreme every day. So it is a dark side of social media. I don't know what the answer is. I'm not recommending anything because I think that it's affecting all of us. The other thing, in terms of Saudi Arabia, Michael Collins Piper, the reason I mention him is because a lot of his ideas from then are now being recycled in terms of how to craft the narrative. So don't prove how it works. Just show that these people were present in this room and said X and whatever, guilt by association, clipping statements and things like that. So in the early 2000s, he was doing tours in the Middle East where he was speaking before Arab and Muslim audiences. So not the Gulf states, those would be Abu Dhabi, which is in the Emirates. I believe he went to Saudi Arabia. He also went to Malaysia. He had a very deep and close relationship with the Prime Minister of Malaysia, or former Prime Minister at the time, who is a well-known Jew hater, and I think he's passed away since, Mahathir Mohamad. And he had so one of the narratives that he came up with about Jewish influence within the actual plot to orchestrate September 11th, it was published in a place called Arab News. I think it was syndicated there. Arab News is owned by the Saudi government. It's through one of their sovereign wealth funds. So for anyone who wants to say, oh, this is, nowadays they want to say, oh, Saudi Arabia and Israel, they're on the same side. Some people are saying, Prince MBS is just this crypto Jew or something. Well, I mean, you have to look at how these people were presenting 9/11 at the time. And if this were true, then they were the biggest marks of all time, right? So they were being wined and dined in some cases. They were being published by these Arab states, and attitudes in the Arab world, I think, have moved away from it. They've moved away from blanket demonization of Israel and said, we want to be pragmatic and we don't like them, but we'll deal with them. What I would say is that nowadays, I think the it's leading from this attitude in the Arab world, ironically consistent with a lot of these Western racial supremacists of Orientalism, looking at Arabs as being too primitive and unsophisticated to pull off the September 11th attacks, which I assure you is the opposite of I went to school with Arab Americans. I have nothing against them. I was actually very good friends with them in college. They're definitely intelligent enough to be engineers. They are engineers. Now, I'm not saying every one of them is a genius, but I had professors that were from Jordan and from Syria, and they are just as capable of teaching and doing research as anyone else. In fact, they're probably overrepresented in the United States now proportionally. So this whole narrative, the Arabs couldn't have done this. The Muslims are like, they're like, I don't believe it because I've worked with them. I've been colleagues with them. I don't believe in any of these narratives where you say, oh, these people couldn't do it because they're not the right type of people. It's just another way to disqualify evidence based on prejudice.
Ray, I really appreciate your spending time with this. You've obviously spent a lot of time, and you've given this a lot of thought. And the fact is, I could go on for another hour with you because there's so many aspects of this. And I was in New York on September 11th, 2001. It was very real to me. That doesn't mean that I knew who did it, but as theories began to spin out and they became more and more preposterous, and, there's even the very big picture of all the things for Israel to do as a false flag. Let's do this so it will be blamed on Iraq, even though it was obviously done by bin Laden in Afghanistan, who admitted that. It's just so crazy. But like you said, it's an inclination that people have, and not only do they not mind contradicting each other, they don't mind contradicting themselves. Whatever will work, and which is, you're very careful not to get too much into the weeds in anti-Semitism.
Well, make no mistake, it is motivated by a lot of hatred. Okay, but the key to fighting this has nothing to, like, people should be allowed to have whatever motivation they, if I don't like, I have my own prejudices. I'm not going to pretend that I'm, Mr. Diversity Month or whatever. But the truth is that if you have a crackpot theory, you have to show real evidence. Okay, one of my favorite movies is one by the guy who did the Obama's dad is not Barack Obama. He made another movie about Paul McCartney being dead, and it's hilarious. It's very entertaining. But once you hear his reasoning, like, this guy must be trolling the world. But so I don't have any problem with people having crazy beliefs, but I think before you go and try to convince other people, do the serious work. Actually make the whole thing function as a plan. Instead of just drawing dots somewhere, show what the connection makes sense, right?
Right.
So that's really the biggest way to criticize, and that's what I call the active way. Now, the passive way, I feel, does happen a lot, but I don't think we can depend on it because, unfortunately, I think it doesn't necessarily mean people abandon those beliefs because the people who promote them are jackasses.
Ray, thanks again.